Welcome to an Inspector Calls AO2 quotes from Mr. Birling. When you're writing an AO2 response, it's best to think about it as zooming in. AO1 we zoom out and we look at the text as a whole, but for AO2 we're going to zoom in on a very specific piece of language. We're going to look at it closely and then we're going to analyse it, almost pulling it apart and looking at how it works. And then we're going to make some connections to the original question. The way we're going to do that is with SLEAL, and there's a sleeping seal there as you can see. Statement, label, evidence, explain, analyse, and then link. Let's look at that more closely. When you're writing about AO2, the first thing you do is you make a statement. This is something that answers the question, so make sure you're referring to the question you were asked originally to make sure that your AO2 response is part of a wider response. Then you're going to label the main technique that forms the quote. Now there might be lots of smaller techniques within the quote, but you're looking for just one main technique, one main method that the writer's using, and you're going to label that. Then you'll immediately go into the evidence where you're going to write the quote out. Now longer quotes might need to be broken into smaller parts, but here you'll basically have the evidence that supports the statement you made at the beginning. Finally, you'll explain that evidence. You'll explain in one sentence, probably using because, to explain what that quote means, just a general understanding of it, to form the foundation of your response, to make sure that you're clear. After that foundation, you're then going to build your response by analysing the quote. Now to do this using a SLEAL in AO2, we're going to focus on the words and phrases from the quote, the key bits of information. We're going to rewrite that as evidence again in our response, and we're going to label it each time we include a new word or phrase. We're going to try to include a technique, labeling them as we go. Then we'll talk about what the phrase means, perhaps in a literal way, and then we're going to explain what it suggests, what the deeper meanings are. And the more of those we can do, the better. Each time you write something, does it have more than one meaning? Does it suggest multiple things? If you can do that, that's going to be really useful for a deeper analysis. Then you might want to think about what connections you can make. So you can make connections to context. How does this quote relate to why the writer was writing? And does this quote link perhaps to any other points in the book? You'll do these probably after you've analysed some of the bigger ideas in the quote. Then think about the writer. What's the writer trying to show us? What do they want us to think? What ideas were they trying to share with us when they were writing this quote? And then finally, a link where you're going to make a comment that links your response back to the question that was asked at the start. So you're reminding the examiner that you're always talking about the question and that this AO2 response is part of that. Our quote from Mr. Birling is mixed up together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. Mr. Birling says this in Act 1 at the one of the early parts of the play. Remember that this quote happens before the inspectors arrived, and it's part of one of the lectures he's giving to his family about the way they should think about the world. Now, as a speech that he delivers, it tells us quite a lot about who he is and how he thinks. He expects to be listened to. He gives many of these speeches at the start of the play, and he expects to be listened to. He dominates the conversation, not really allowing other characters to speak unless they're agreeing with him. Now, this allows him to have control, so that reveals something about the way he thinks and the way he believes things should be. As a man of a certain class, it's quite easy to say, I think, here at this point, that he expects that both men and wealthier people should dominate socially. One of the other things he does is he asserts his opinions, but in such a way as if they were facts, to try and make it seem like he's right, to brook no argument. He disagrees through this quote with the idea of social responsibility, of looking after other people in society, and he's a symbol of capitalism, something we know that Priestley was not a fan of. He uses the pronoun we here to suggest that being categorised, we were all mixed up together, with other people is unpleasant to him. He would rather stand on his own, and this creates a sense of his superiority, as if he's more important than the rest of society. The phrase mixed up tells us a little bit about how he sees about the class system, which is designed to keep people separate. And in 1912, it was much harder for someone to change their social class. This suits Mr. Birling and people like him because being part of that higher class allows him to maintain his power and his wealth and treat other people less well. He believes that mixing up the class system, the collapse of that system, with wealth being distributed more easily, with people having more to share, with people looking after each other, he believes that will take something away from him. And because he's quite selfish, that's a worry for him. Mr. Birling uses the zoomorphic simile like bees in a hive. The first thing we think of with a zoomorphic simile is that it removes people's humanity. By seeing this group of people as animals or insects, makes it easier to treat them badly, to not think of them as humans. If they're less than human, then their rights don't matter as much as the people's. That's the logic he's using here. This is why Eva Smith's so important, because she serves the narrative to give us a human face, a human story, so that these people aren't just a group of people with no face, with no character. They are real humans. Bees are insects, and that suggests that Birling thinks that socialists, or people that believe that society should be responsibility for each other, those people are primitive or regressive in some way. Ironically though, bees work together incredibly well, and they work for the benefit of the entire hive. Birling sees himself as superior to that, as above those sorts of ideas. Bees also work together. There's no abuse of the workforce. They're productive, hardworking, organised, they've got shared goals, and all of this sounds really desirable. However, they do have a queen, so there is a hierarchy within a hive, and it illustrates Mr. Birling's foolishness in a very subtle way because he chooses a simile that doesn't perfectly illustrate his point. Bees also have a matriarchal society. There are patriarchal attitudes in this play that damage Eva Smith and cause some of the events to happen in the play. That patriarchal attitude is subtly mocked here because this foolish character, who's clearly wrong in everything he says, he talks about bees who are a matriarchal society that work together, a better society than the one he lives in. Finally, bees are pollinators. Without bees, we would die, human beings would die. And so there's a suggestion that without the working class, the middle classes wouldn't have anything to support their lifestyle. When Mr. Birling uses the noun community, something that suggests connection, working together, a group of people that support each other, a reminder that our actions aren't in isolation. Everything we do affects other people. That's a key idea in this play. Priestley is reminding us that our actions affect others when he shows us what the Birlings do to Eva Smith. Few people could argue that community was a bad thing. The fact that Mr. Birling does argue it's a bad thing suggests he's selfish, that his values are corrupt, and that he thinks everybody should just look after themselves. But human beings live in groups. Throughout history, we have been at our most successful when we work together as communities. The fact that he dismisses this reveals his foolishness. A bit of context here. So the audience of the play in 1945 were poorer after the war. And as well as this, they had a strong sense of community because they'd worked together. So this idea of Birling criticising working together and criticising poorer people, it just makes him seem unfeeling, naive and inhumane. When Mr. Birling calls community nonsense, he continues this idea of dismissing sensible ideas, ridiculing social responsibility and socialism, which don't make sense to him, make him out to be somebody who is not particularly kind, not particularly forward-thinking. Now, Mr. Birling is there to represent capitalist people. He's a caricature, though, a cartoonish mockery of what it means to be a capitalist. His whole quote here makes him seem like a fool, someone who is arrogant, privileged, who doesn't understand. And we want to see him taught a lesson. When he says things like Titanic, and he talks about the unsinkable nature of it, and he also talks about war and the fact it will never happen, we already know that he's foolish. This quote just reinforces that. It's structurally significant, which is still an AO2 idea, because when the inspector arrives, the audience already knows that he's going to be proven wrong. His ideas are so wrong, and people who are watching him see this very clearly. These unshakable beliefs that a modern audience, an audience of the time, a contemporary audience, would immediately know to be false, show him to be stubborn, unchanging, and a character that we shouldn't respect in any great way.